Hello and welcome back to Drive Driver Driven. I'm Humble and we're back on the MK again today. Last time we left off at a little bit of an impasse trying to get the engine into the car and realizing that things didn't quite line up the way we wanted them to. So today we're gonna jump forward a little bit because let me show you. Well, it's in. I won't say that it was a struggle. It was more work than I anticipated, but I didn't realize how tight a fit the K24 would be versus a K20, and how tight the chassis would be on an unknown pan. So again, this is all on me. I mentioned last time that I'm using a dry sump system that the factory hasn't tried fitting before, and if you were to use a K20 with their pan meant for rear wheel drive setup, it would work just fine. The clearances are tight, but everything fits like it should. The issues I had were this mount on the driver's side is different from a K24 block to a K20, and there was a cross rail up here on the chassis, which, as you can see, we've cut out. That was interfering with the very front of our oil pan, specifically right where the geared oil pump sits on this internal dry sump AT Power pan and pump assembly. I wasn't willing to switch because that was one of the key components I wanted to use on this build, so instead the chassis gets the chop. And I think what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to clean this up a little bit better and actually run a plate across so that I can mount the spin trick to that plate. And then we'll just have to tackle the plumbing side. Life would be easier if you do this in a right-hand drive car versus a left-hand drive car. Mostly because of the way the ins and outs work on the K-Series engines and this particular dry sump pump assembly. So our input is at the front and our output is at the back, which means that from the tank, the line has to go under the engine and then up into the pump. From the pump out of the motor, we have to come up, which there's not a lot of room behind this mount, so I'm going to have to find a very tight 90 degree, which might just be a direct ORB 90 degree fitting that comes out of there, runs forward into our spin trick. It's going to come out of the spin trick and then actually cross over this side into our oil cooler, out of our oil cooler, and then go down the motor and into our oil tank. And then the air outlet from our spin trick is probably going to stay low. The air output of our spin trick is going to stay low and then run and chase this chassis rail all the way down and then come up and go into our tank. On this side of the engine specifically, we're going to have to dodge the exhaust, which, speaking of, doesn't fit. We tried getting the header's over here. We tried getting the header in, and this hole needs to come back probably at least 1.5 inches. Like I said before, though, I'm not too worried about it because we can put a garnish plate over it, make it look pretty, but by coming back another 1.5 inches or so, it'll make this opening more square, which means that the eventual exhaust that it's going to get with the large primaries, there's going to be ample amounts of room around so that we can work those tubes in. So I'm not too worried about that. That's something I anticipated. I really didn't want to have to cut the body again, but it's not the end of the world. Moving on, other trouble spots. There wasn't too much from the fitting the motor other than the mounts, which I've addressed already. If you're running a left-hand drive car and you have the NA or NB Mazda transmission, normally your shift fork will come out right down here, and you may or may not need to trim the footwell. But if, like me, you shorten the footwell for a dry sump setup, you don't have to do anything. Like you can run the stock slave cylinder setup and the throwout bearing assembly and you do not need to switch to the annular hydraulic setup that I've done. I didn't know about that. I should have looked, but again, I didn't know how the motor would be placed or if there would be room. I'm happy with the annular hydraulic setup. It's just a little more work if I ever need to do anything to the slave cylinder because it's an engine out procedure. Something else we ran into, and the whole motor's gonna have to come out again anyway to clean this up, but we had to chop the power plant frame mount off of the transmission. It was just too close to this tube, and we were hitting this tube when trying to get the motor in place. It was just too tight, and it caused interference with the reverse switch on the other side of the transmission, which I'll show you. So we just made the call to chop the power plant frame to make room, and I'll come back and clean up the work. Sean did the deed. He chopped all this off, and I'm just going to come after it after the fact and grind this down and clean it up and make it look a little bit prettier. Not that anyone's going to see back here anyway, but it'll just remove stress risers and that sort of thing, and just make it look a little nicer. Now, speaking of reverse switch, so that's this guy here, and as you can see, it is very tight tolerance on this diagonal tube, on this kind of vertical brace that sits in here. And if I shine a little light on there, because I don't know how well this is showing up, you can see just how tight that is in there. This is enough that it'll clear, but only just. And if we look at it from the top, you can see that it'll just barely clear the panel. So that reverse switch is a very, very close fit. And that's just kind of a heads up to anyone who's running this setup. Just expect that to be a really tight. Likewise, I mentioned before about this bolt that's under here, or this nut. You have to get that nut and the washer in place on the mount before you slide that, you slide that slot in there. Otherwise, you can't get that nut in from the top. There's just not enough room to try and lift it and get that in there. So just a heads up when you're trying to fit the transmission in. One last thing is, I don't know if I mentioned it previously when I went through and I clearanced the transmission. As you can see, there is a gaping hole here. Well, somebody, and we won't mention my name here, did a fantastic job of clearancing. But when he applied the template, it was upside down. And so the hole was down here, and it needed to be up here. So yes, when you are clearancing your transmission, make sure that you're putting your hole in the right place. I'm not too worried about like structure or anything like that. There's plenty of bolts around the bell housing. I didn't remove any bolts that fasten the bell housing to the engine. There's no like ribbing or anything that's really compromised. So I'm not too worried about this compromising the transmission in any way. And even if it did, I can always go out and get a new bell housing assembly piece and just redo that in the future. It's not the end of the world. So this will give us kind of an idea of how big this motor is in this chassis. And we guesstimated with the factory, like me and Neil, that it would fit because this engine's only 0.4 inches, give or take, taller than a K20. But we've already tried pre-fitting some of the body pieces and realized that it's actually significantly taller than a K20. So a K20 barely fits in, up inside the scoop, and that's fine. However, this whole area is farther forward than on the K20. Even though this is a K20 head, because of how things are positioned, it sits a little farther forward. And this is above where it needs to be. The trumpets on the intake are actually above the hood line. So we're gonna have to cut a hole in the hood for our filter assembly once that arrives. I'm not super upset about that because I kind of love that look. And every time we get on boil, we can play the song of our people and let everyone hear it. So just as a teaser, I've already got the throttle cable hooked up, and you can see these massive throttle bodies. And when we get this on full tilt and let it eat, and the new exhaust in place, I think this side of the engine is going to make just as much noise as the exhaust. Now this is kind of a review video. We're not quite done. Even though the engine is in the car, it's got to come out again. I'm gonna have to paint and seal that engine mount that we made, take care of the chassis and get that sealed up, and mount a plate so that the spin trick can sit where it's supposed to be mounted. There's a few other things that we need to do to get the engine and transmission to a point where it can be finally bolted in. So this is a minor victory, but a victory nonetheless, and this is really where I wanted to be for the weekend. From this point forward, as I said previously, is I can work on plumbing, I can start to work on wiring, which is, there's gonna be a huge job in wiring. I wanted to go kind of full Haltech for this build, so I've invested a lot into their PDM, their ECU, all their sensor packages, and so on. And so placing those in the car is going to be critical, and I can do that now that we have the engine and transmission in place. So another kind of point and talk, which we've had a lot of these, and I'm sorry, that's just the way some of this boils down when I've got like Sean or other people here helping with me. I basically just get distracted into the work, and I'd rather not stop if I can help it to film and do a segment. That's just how some of these go sometimes. But I want to try and get more work on camera for the next one. Hopefully something more compelling than wiring and plumbing, because those aren't exactly riveting content. So that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.